Amaka staggered into the compound, with tears streaming down her face, with a heavy basket of cassava pressing into her aching shoulders, her baby tied tightly to her back, crying softly from the heat. Sweat ran down her face, her wrapper soaked, her steps slow but determined. Yet right there, under the shade, Chinedu, her husband, sat laughing loudly in the compound, fully absorbed in a game of draught with his friends, as if her struggle didn't exist. That was the moment something inside her began to shift. Sit back as we unveil this shocking story. Amaka had not always looked like this. There was a time, not so many years ago, when she had carried herself with a certain lightness, the kind that comes from being young and full of hope, from believing that the future holds something sweet just beyond the horizon. She had been a girl who laughed freely, who walked with her head high down the red dust paths of Umuoha village, who wore her wrapper with the confidence of someone who believed life was on her side. That girl still existed somewhere inside the woman who now staggered into the compound under the punishing weight of the afternoon sun. But she had been buried slowly, layer by layer, beneath years of work and worry and silent endurance, until even Amaka herself sometimes forgot she was there. She had married Chinedu at 22, when he was full of promise, and the whole village spoke well of him. He had been apprenticed to a tailor in the city for 3 years, had come back with fine ideas and a confident stride, and had courted Amaka with the kind of attention that makes a woman feel chosen. Her mother had approved, her father had given his blessing. And so Amaka had stepped into that marriage with everything she had, her heart, her labour, her complete and unwavering devotion. The first 2 years were ordinary but good. Chinedu worked at his sewing machine beneath the mango tree, taking in alterations and small tailoring jobs. Amaka tended their small farm plot behind the house, cultivating cassava, cocoyam, and a modest stand of plantain. Together they managed. Together they were building something. Then the sewing machine broke. And then Chinedu's most reliable customer, a civil servant from the next town, relocated. And then Chinedu met a group of idle men at the Palm Wine Bar near the market, men who had long since given up on serious work and spent their days making noise over a draught board, drinking cheap kai-kai, and laughing too loud about things that were not funny. The sewing machine was never repaired. The farm became Amaka's alone. By the time their son, Emeka, was born, the household had quietly reorganized itself around one truth. Amaka was the engine that made everything run. She woke before the sun, before the roosters, while the village still lay in the thick blue darkness of early morning. She would cook, clean, feed the baby, strap Emeka to her back, and be on the farm before most people had opened their eyes. She farmed through the morning heat, sold produce at the roadside market in the afternoons, carried water from the borehole, cooked dinner, and settled the baby to sleep. Only then, in the deep stillness of night, would she allow herself to rest, though rest, for her, was never quite complete. Even in sleep, her body knew it was only resting, so it could begin again. Chinedu, meanwhile, had perfected the art of the morning stretch. He would rise late, move slowly, eat what Amaka had prepared, and then drift toward the shade where his friends gathered with their draught board and their opinions. If Amaka asked for money for the market, he would suck his teeth and say business was slow, or that he was owed money he had not yet collected. If she asked him to help carry water or tend to Amaka while she rested her back, he would point out that he was tired, or that he was in the middle of something, or that she was strong and could manage. And she did manage. That was the tragedy of it. Because Amaka managed, no one, not even Chinedu, was forced to confront the question of what would happen if she stopped. She did not ask for recognition. She asked for partnership. What she got was a man who had learned to receive without seeing. Amaka had made a private ritual of her endurance. Each time the weight grew too heavy, she told herself it was temporary, that Chinedu was going through a difficult season, that men sometimes lost their footing and needed time to find it again. She told herself this with the conviction of someone desperately hoping that repetition would make it true. She told herself this in January, when Chinedu borrowed money from her market earnings to join a gambling ring he was certain would double their income, and instead lost every kobo. She told herself this in March, when their landlord knocked on the gate with the barely concealed contempt of a man who had been patient far too long and warned that 2 months of rent was outstanding. She told herself this in May, when Amaka fell ill with malaria and she had to sell the cocoyam she had been saving just to buy medicine from the chemist. She told herself this on the afternoon she returned from the farm to find the kitchen empty, not merely out of a particular ingredient, but empty in the more complete and heartbreaking sense. The gari was finished. The palm oil was finished. The little tin where she kept her emergency money, the modest folded notes she hid beneath a cloth in the corner of the bedroom, had been quietly discovered and emptied. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time, saying nothing, feeling something calcify slowly in her chest. That night, Amaka cried from hunger. He was 8 months old, and his cry was thin and desolate, the cry of a body that did not yet understand why it was suffering, only that it was. Amaka sat in the dark and held him to her chest and rocked him, singing softly, her own belly empty, the night pressing in around her. And she understood then that something in her had cracked a little deeper. She did not cry. She had passed the stage of crying. Crying requires a certain luxury of time and privacy, and the belief that tears might change something. Amaka no longer had any of those things. In the morning, she rose before the darkness lifted, went to the neighbour's house, and borrowed a cup of gari and a small tin of oil. She did not explain why she was borrowing. The neighbour, an older woman, did not ask. There was a particular kind of silence between women in a village, like Umuoha, a silence that said, "I see you, and I am sorry, and here is what I can do." The debts accumulated the way such things always do in households that are quietly falling apart, not all at once, not in a single dramatic catastrophe, but in small accumulations that each seem manageable on their own, until the day you look up and find yourself buried. There was the money owed to the chemist, the money owed to the woman who sold kerosene, the money owed to the tailor who had sewn Amaka's naming ceremony outfit on credit, back when Amaka had been briefly and foolishly optimistic. The money owed to the landlord, which had now grown from 2 months to 3. Amaka took on additional work. She began washing clothes for 3 families in the compound behind the church-heavy, thankless work that left her hands raw and her back screaming. She trekked 3 extra kilometres past her usual market to sell at a larger trading post, where the prices were slightly better. She woke earlier. She slept later. She ate less, telling herself she was not hungry when she was, saving what little there was for Emeka. Chinedu noticed none of this. Or perhaps he noticed and chose the comfortable blindness of someone who understands on some level that seeing clearly would require him to act. One evening, Amaka came home to find him in excellent spirits. He had apparently won a draft today, not money, just the game, and was full of the loud energy of a man who felt victorious. He wanted to know what was for dinner and whether there was any pepper soup, because pepper soup would be very fine right now. Amaka looked at him for a long moment. Then she went into the kitchen and began to cook what there was to cook, which was not pepper soup. In every village, there are people who see things clearly before the people living inside them are able to. Mama Ifeoma was one such person. She was perhaps 60, perhaps older, the kind of age that in a village like Umuoha commands automatic respect, the kind of age worn on the face and in the eyes, like a recorded history of everything witnessed. She had buried a husband, raised 5 children largely on her own, married off 3 daughters, and sat on the Women's Council for many years. She had seen the particular story of Amaka and Chinedu before, had seen it in other marriages, in other compounds, in earlier generations, and she recognized its shape with the grim familiarity of someone who knows how such stories end when no one intervenes. Mama Ifeoma began stopping Chinedu when she saw him walking to meet his friends. She would do it casually, a hand on his arm, a quiet word, the veneer of chit-chat, but her meaning was always direct. "That wife of yours," she told him one morning, "she is working herself to the bone. You know what happens to a rope that carries too much weight for too long?" Chinedu would laugh, shake his head, tell her that Amaka was fine, that she was a strong woman, that she liked to work. Mama Ifeoma would look at him with eyes that had seen too much to be deceived by comfortable answers, and she would say no more, but she watched. She always watched. What Mama Ifeoma could not see was the more private war being waged inside Chinedu's group of friends, the invisible currents of envy and ego that were shaping him from within. There was a man called Obi in the draft group, handsome in a careless way and possessed of the particular cruelty that comes wrapped in jokes. Obi had never married, had never wanted the accountability of a household, and had never quite forgiven other men for the choices that made them appear more decent by comparison. He had noticed, over weeks of watching Chinedu, that Chinedu relied on his wife in a way that Obi found both useful and entertaining. He began with small comments, casual things said while looking at the draft board, things that could be laughed off or ignored. "I hear say Amaka go market again today, That woman sha hardworking like man." A pause, a glance at Chinedu. "Good thing one of you is..." Laughter from the others. Chinedu laughing too, but his jaw tight. Over weeks, the comments sharpened. They were always deniable, always framed as jokes, but they had a target and they found it reliably. Obi told Chinedu, always laughing, that a man who allowed his wife to be the provider had forfeited something essential about his manhood. He said it in the language of the compound, colourful, exaggerated, crowd-pleasing, but the message was consistent and corrosive. Chinedu began to come home in the evenings, carrying a new quality of silence, not the neutral silence of a tired man, but the pressurized silence of someone building a case. He began picking arguments over small things. The soup was too salty. Why was the compound not swept? Why did Amaka speak to him that way in front of Emeka? He was not entirely wrong that something had changed in Amaka's manner. She had grown quieter, more efficient, and less inclined to the softness of earlier years. But what he was interpreting as disrespect was simply exhaustion wearing the face of endurance. He could not see the difference. He was no longer looking closely enough to see, and so the household moved toward its crisis on two tracks simultaneously. Amaka running harder and growing more depleted, and Chinedu becoming more defensive and withdrawn, both of them moving away from each other while still sleeping under the same roof, still eating from the same pot, still nodding to each other across the compound as if everything were ordinary. Amaka's inner battle was the quietest and the most devastating of all. She was not a woman who spoke her suffering easily. She came from a line of women who endured, who held their pain with a kind of dignified privacy, who believed that complaining was a form of weakness. But endurance, she was slowly learning, had its own terminal point, and she was approaching it. She began to have thoughts she was ashamed of. Thoughts of leaving, of packing Emeka and walking out of the compound and not coming back. Thoughts of what it would feel like to be responsible only for herself and her child. These thoughts frightened her, not because they were wicked, but because they felt, increasingly, like relief. She was also afraid of the village. She knew what would be said if she left, how quickly the story would be rewritten, so that she was the difficult wife, the woman with too much pride, the one who had abandoned her husband instead of trying harder. She had seen this happen to other women, so she stayed and she worked. And she carried the weight that was hers, and the weight that was Chinedu's, and the weight of her own unspoken grief, all at once, all without relief, day after day, across the burning months. The greatest distance between two people is not measured in miles. It is measured in the silence that grows between them in the same room. It was in the dry season that Amaka fell ill. The harmattan had come early that year, bringing with it the familiar dry cold of those weeks when the sky turns white with dust and the air tastes of distance and the skin cracks at the knuckles. It was the kind of season that laid people low, but the harmattan also had a way of finding those whose bodies had been pushed past their limits, as if the cold were merely permission for what the body had been waiting to say. Amaka woke one morning and could not rise. This was extraordinary. In all the months of her difficulty, she had not once failed to rise. The act of rising had become almost philosophical for her, a daily assertion that she was still here, still capable, still holding things together. But that morning, her body simply refused. Her head pounded with the specific brutality of high fever. Her joints ached as if they had been filled with hot sand. Her throat was swollen and dry. She lay there for 20 minutes, arguing with herself. The market would not wait. The cassava she had harvested yesterday needed to be sold today. Emeka would need to be fed. The water drum was nearly empty. She rose anyway. She dressed slowly, tied Emeka to her back, and began the walk to the farm. Chinedu was still sleeping when she left. She managed the morning by sheer will, a force that is perhaps the most underappreciated human capability. The ability of a body to perform under conditions it should not be able to perform under, driven by the knowledge that stopping would cost more than continuing. But will has limits, and the body always remembers what the mind tries to override. By mid-morning, she was weaker. By the time the sun had climbed to its highest and cruelest position, the path back from the farm seemed to stretch and waver before her. She could feel Amaka's weight on her back, his warm, heavy, trusting weight, and she could feel her own legs growing uncertain beneath her. Her vision blurred at the edges. The sounds of the road grew muffled and strange. She walked on. She was so close to the compound. Just past the junction, past the mango tree, past the borehole. She did not make it past the mango tree. Amaka collapsed in the red dust of the footpath, her basket spilling open beside her. Amaka still strapped to her back, beginning to cry from the disruption and the heat. She went down not dramatically, not with a cry or a struggle, but quietly, the way a building goes down when the last support gives way. One moment she was walking, the next she was on the ground. And the ground was a strange relief. It was a schoolgirl who saw her first, a young girl in a blue and white uniform who stood and stared for one frozen second before she ran, screaming for help, toward the nearest houses. Within minutes, 4 or 5 adults had gathered. A man lifted Amaka from Amaka's back. A woman knelt in the dust beside her, pressing her palm to Amaka's forehead and drawing a sharp breath at the heat of the fever. "Get her husband," someone said. "Go and call Chinedu." A boy was dispatched at a run. The boy found Chinedu at his usual place under the neem tree at the edge of the compound, seated opposite Obi over the draft board. His friends arranged around him in the comfortable configuration of men who believe the afternoon belongs to them. Chinedu was laughing at something when the boy arrived, breathless and wide-eyed, and told him, "Your wife has fallen on the road." For a moment, Chinedu did not move. The words seemed to land at some distance from him, as if they needed to travel a particular terrain before they reached somewhere he could hear them. Then he ran. He would remember the sight of her for the rest of his life. Amaka lay on the dusty red path with people crowded around her, her wrapper dark with sweat and dust, her face turned slightly to the side, her breath visible but shallow, the breath of a body in retreat. Amaka was being held by a woman nearby, still crying, his face crumpled with distress, reaching his arms toward the still form of his mother. The spilled cassava lay in the dust around Amaka, like a scattered offering, the concrete evidence of where she had been going and what she had been carrying and why. Chinedu stopped when he saw her. He stopped with the particular arrested quality of a man who has been running and then collides with something immovable. His breath came in unsteady pulls. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Around him, the gathered villagers watched him, some with concern, some with the barely disguised judgment of people who had been watching this situation unfold for a long time and had their own opinions about how it had arrived here. He pushed through the small crowd and knelt in the dust beside his wife, Amaka. His voice came out rough, thickened by something he didn't have a name for yet. Amaka. Her eyes fluttered. She was not unconscious. She was somewhere in the difficult in-between place, not quite here, not quite gone. Her lips moved slightly, but no words came. Chinedu took her hand. It was rough, the hand of someone who had been working with earth and water and manual labour for years, and it was burning with fever, and it was thinner than he remembered. When had her hands gotten so thin? When had the bones become so prominent beneath the skin? When had he last actually held this hand and noticed what it felt like? He could not remember. That was when it broke open inside him, not gradually, not gently, but all at once, the way a dam goes when the pressure exceeds what it was built to hold. He saw, in a single terrible moment of clarity, what he had refused to see across all those months. He saw Amaka rising before dawn. He saw her strapping Amaka to her back and walking to the farm while he slept. He saw her returning in the heat of the afternoon, carrying weights that should have been shared. He saw her cooking on an empty stomach to feed a household she was sustaining alone. He saw the money she had saved disappearing, and her not saying a word, just finding another way to manage. He saw the nights she must have lain beside him in the dark, carrying the full weight of their shared failure, saying nothing because she had learned that saying something did not change anything. He saw himself clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not the comfortable self-image he had maintained the man in a difficult season, the man temporarily stuck, the man who would get back on his feet when conditions improved, but the actual self, the man who had allowed his wife to carry everything, the man who had taken her strength and called it her nature, the man who had mistaken her endurance for contentment and her silence for acceptance, the men who had carried Amaka to the compound, the women who had organized her transport to the health clinic, the neighbours who sat in the yard with Emeka and brought water and bitter leaf to reduce the fever, all of these people performed acts of care that Chinedu watched with a new and painful awareness. They were doing for his wife what he should have been doing. They were the safety net that had caught her when he, the person most obligated to be her support, had long since failed to fulfill that role. Mama Ifeoma was there, as she always was in moments like this. She did not say anything to Chinedu. She did not need to. She simply looked at him with those eyes that had seen too much to be surprised. And in her look was everything she had said to him over the months and everything he had dismissed. The look said, "Now you see. Now you understand what I was trying to tell you." Chinedu sat on the ground of the compound, his back against the wall, Emeka in his lap, and he did not move for a long time. He had not cried in years. He cried now, not loudly, not the performance of grief, but quietly, the way men cry when they are not trying to, when something breaks through the careful architecture of pride and indifference they have spent years constructing. He pressed his face into the top of Emeka's head and wept for what he had done and what he had failed to do, and the woman lying inside who had somehow loved him enough to keep carrying what he had dropped. A man does not know what he has taken for granted until the day it lies unconscious in the red dust, and he is standing over it with nothing to offer but the belated gift of his attention. Amaka was in the health clinic for 4 days. The nurse said it was severe exhaustion compounded by infection, the kind of collapse that announces itself when a body that has been running on insufficient fuel for too long finally refuses to be overridden. Chinedu did not leave the clinic those first 2 days. He sat on the wooden bench in the corridor, sleeping in small, uncomfortable increments, eating what Mama Ifeoma brought him, and waiting. He was not good at waiting. He was not good at sitting in the consequences of his own choices, with nothing to do but feel them. But he did it. He sat there, and he felt it, and he did not look for the exits. When Amaka was well enough to speak, she did not immediately speak to him. She lay in the thin clinic bed with Amaka beside her, and she looked at the ceiling, and she gathered herself with the patient deliberateness of someone who knows that what comes next matters and is choosing their words with care. Eventually, she spoke. She did not shout. She did not weep. She spoke in the quiet, level voice of a woman who has moved past the need for drama because she has arrived, through suffering, at clarity. She told Chinedu what these months had been. She told him not to make him feel guilty, though he should feel guilty, but because she needed him to understand fully, in specific detail, without any softening, what his choices had cost her. She spoke about the nights with empty cupboards, the borrowed Gary, the mornings she had risen ill and worked anyway because the alternative was hunger. She spoke about Emeka crying from hunger on the night of the empty kitchen, and she watched Chinedu receive this particular piece of information like a man receiving a blow, and she did not soften it because it should not be softened. She told him she had been ready to leave. She told him that the thought of walking away had felt, at certain moments, like the only merciful thing she could do for herself and for their son. She told him this not as a threat, but as the truth, because the truth was all she had left, and she was no longer willing to carry even a small portion of untruth. Chinedu listened. He did not interrupt, did not explain himself, did not offer the reflexive defences that had been his habit in all the arguments of the previous months. He listened the way a man listens when he has finally understood that he is being given information he cannot afford to dismiss. When she was done, he said, I know what I did. I know what I didn't do. I'm sorry. I'm not asking for sorry, she said quietly. I'm asking for change. Sorry doesn't feed the baby. Sorry doesn't pay the landlord. Sorry doesn't wake up before dawn and go to the farm. She paused. Can you change? It was a real question. She was not certain of the answer. He said, I will try. And then, after a moment, he said, I will do more than try. The days that followed Amaka's return from the clinic were delicate and careful, like the first steps taken on a limb that has been broken and is beginning to heal. They were not suddenly happy. They were not miraculously transformed. What they were was watchful two people in the same house, paying attention to each other with a new intentionality. Chinedu made changes that were initially small and then grew. He rose earlier. He began by bringing Amaka water in the morning before she rose. He started repairs on his old sewing machine, sourcing the parts through a contact in the market town, spending evenings crouched over it with the focused expression of someone who has rediscovered a skill he thought he had abandoned. He went to the draft group less. Then he stopped going entirely. Obi said something sharp about it. Obi always had something sharp to say, and Chinedu looked at him for a long moment and saw, finally, what kind of man he was. My wife needs me at home, Chinedu said simply, and walked away and did not go back. He began accompanying Amaka to the market on Eke days, carrying the heavy basket she had always carried alone. He held Amaka in the evenings so she could rest. He found honest work repairs, alterations, small commissions from neighbours who discovered that his hands still remembered what they had once been taught. These things did not happen without difficulty. There were weeks when Chinedu slipped back into old habits. There were nights of cold silence and days of careful distance. Trust, once lost, does not return simply because the conditions have improved. It must be rebuilt deliberately across time through the accumulated evidence of consistent small choices. Amaka watched. She was not passive in this watching. When Chinedu slipped, she said so. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in the clear, direct language of someone who has decided that she will not carry what is unsaid any longer. She had carried enough. She would not carry silence too. There were conversations they had not had before, conversations about money, about fear, about what it felt like to be where each of them had been. Chinedu told her, haltingly, about the shame he had felt when Obi mocked him, and how the shame had made him small, and how being small had made him mean. Amaka listened. She did not excuse it, but she heard it. "You were afraid," she said, "but I was afraid too. The difference is that I kept going anyway. I needed you to keep going too." He nodded. There was nothing more to say to that. Umuoha was a village of watchers. It always had been. Lives were lived in proximity, and stories moved through the compound walls and the market stalls and the women washing at the borehole with the ease of water finding its level. The story of Amaka's collapse and what followed became one of those village stories that circulate not as gossip but as instruction, the kind of narrative that people pass down in the telling not to entertain but to teach. Mothers told it to daughters. Women mentioned it in the quiet solidarity of the borehole conversations. The older men told it to younger men as a kind of warning, though young men always believe such warnings are meant for someone else. Mama Ifeoma said, when asked for her account of what had happened, something that became one of those phrases that settle into a community's consciousness and remain. Water that is always pouring will one day run dry. And the person who poured it, you don't thank them until you're thirsty and there is nothing left. The village had seen women carry impossible loads before. It would see it again. But Amaka's story had the particular power of a story that ends not in defeat, but in reckoning a woman who had been brought to the ground not by her own weakness, but by the accumulated weight of everyone else's refusal to cause. Sherrit, who had survived and who had spoken her truth from a clinic bed with a quiet authority that shook something loose in the man who heard it. What the village learned, slowly, was something it had perhaps always known but rarely named, that strength in a woman is not a license to demand more of her, that a woman who carries everything without breaking is not evidence that the load is appropriate, that the silence of endurance is not the same as the silence of contentment, and that confusing the two has costs that are eventually paid, one way or another, by everyone. They also learned something about men, about how pride and shame, improperly managed, can hollow a person out and leave them performing the appearance of presence while their real self goes absent. About how the company a man keeps can either call him to his best self or license his worst. About how waking up to one's failures is not comfortable but is finally the only responsible response to the evidence of those failures. Emeka grew up in a household that was different after his mother's collapse than it had been before. Not perfect. No household is perfect. But different in the most important way. Balanced. His father rose with him in the mornings sometimes. His mother rested in the afternoons sometimes. The weight was shared, not always evenly, not always gracefully, but shared, which is all that a weight really requires to be bearable. Amaka, for her part, recovered fully in body. In spirit, she recovered into someone slightly different from the woman she had been before the collapse, not harder, not bitter, but clearer. She had looked at the edge of her own limits and returned from it with a knowledge that cannot be taught any other way, the knowledge of exactly how much she was worth and exactly how much she would no longer be willing to give away for free. She continued to work. She always would work was not a burden for Amaka, but a form of dignity. But she worked now with boundaries. She worked without carrying what was not hers to carry. She worked as a woman who had decided firmly and without apology that her survival was not optional, not a secondary consideration to be addressed after everyone else's needs had been met, but the foundation on which everything else was built, because a woman who collapses cannot hold anyone up, because a rope stretched beyond its limit does not keep stretching, it breaks. Because strength, real strength, is not about how much you can endure alone. It is about knowing when to put down the weight and demand that someone else pick up their share. And if you walked past the compound on a quiet evening, you might see them, the whole family together, in the last cool light before night. Chinedu with Amaka on his knee, Amaka nearby with her hands at rest, the three of them making the small ordinary noise of a household that has survived something difficult and arrived, bruised but intact, at something like peace. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. Strength should never be mistaken for endless endurance, and those who carry everything alone will one day be forced to drop it. A home is not held together by one person's love alone. It is held together by two people choosing every day to reach for the other side of the weight. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification, because we bring to you real-life stories that will inspire you. God bless you and see you in the next video. Please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.